And I yield to the author of the measure, Steve Cohen, the gentleman from Memphis, Tennessee.
Without objection.
As much time as he may consume.
Without objection, the gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the chairman for his courtesies and the ranking member in helping bring this bill to the floor today. I rise today in support of H.R. 6146, which I introduced with Congressman Issa of California. The bill is designed to address the phenomenon of libel tourism, whereby plaintiffs seek judgments from foreign courts against American authors and publishers for making allegedly defamatory statements. The fact is, these statements in these cases would not be considered defamatory in American courts, where the First Amendment gives our authors and people the protection of the First Amendment. But in certain jurisdictions, even countries that have similar legal systems to ours, the First Amendment is not recognized, and the libel laws are much different, and plaintiffs have less burdens to prove to get judgments against defendants. This threatens to undermine our nation's core free speech principles as embodied in the First Amendment. U.S. law places this higher burden on defamation plaintiffs to safeguard our First Amendment protected speech. We've seen problems with this, and particularly in courts in England, and the state of New York has already acted and passed a bill to protect authors and publishers in the First Amendment, but there was a need to have such on a national basis. Thomas Jefferson memorialized with a monument here in Washington. My friend Randy Wade and I visited Thomas Jefferson recently, and around the top of the monument is a statement from Thomas Jefferson known for, I have sworn upon the altar of the Almighty God eternal hostility against all forms of tyranny over the minds of men, to infringe on the opportunity for people to write books and publish, which is what this does infringe, is tyranny over the minds of men. And so I believe Jefferson would join with us today in support of this proposal. H.R. 6146 will codify the principle that while U.S. courts will normally enforce judgments of foreign courts, they should not do so when the foreign judgments undermine our Constitution, and particularly our precious First Amendment. Specifically, our bill prohibits U.S. courts from recognizing or enforcing foreign defamation judgments that do not comport with that First Amendment. I believe the passage of this bill will dissuade those who would seek to circumvent our First Amendment by filing actions in libel-friendly forums that do not share our protections and then threaten our authors with judgments. I thank again Chairman Conyers and Ranking Member Smith for their assistance in bringing this bill to the floor on suspension. I also thank Congressman Issa for his help, and Congressman Peter King. Representative King had a different bill on the same subject. He's shown leadership on this issue from his home state of New York, and he joined with us in this particular bill to try to get it passed here in this Congress. Adam Cohen, no relation to me in any way whatsoever, opined in the New York Times that this bill needed to become law immediately. And so we did go into warp speed to get this to the floor. I'm committed to working with Mr. King next year, and I've talked to Chairman Conyers, and he's in agreement that we should have a public hearing next year on this legislation, and with Mr. King's ideas that go further than this bill to discuss how far libel tourism should go. And that hearing, which I think would satisfy Senator Specter's office and others on the Senate side, would have a deeper aspect of the need to protect our authors and the freedom of speech. I'd also like to thank the Association of American Publishers, and particularly former Congressperson Pat Schroeder, the Media Law Resource Center, and Professor Michael Broad of Emory University Law School for their input on the bill. The bill has strong bipartisan support. I urge its immediate passage, and I once again thank from the bottom of my heart my chairman, who I am fortunate to serve with, and the ranking member who has been so kind to me during my first term. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to say that I support this legislation, and I want to thank the gentleman from Tennessee, my colleague on the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Cohen, for his persistent efforts in promoting this legislation. I'd like now to yield 3 minutes to my Texas colleague, Mr. Poe.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I want to thank my friend from Texas for yielding, Mr. Conyers for pushing this legislation, especially Mr. Cohen from Tennessee for sponsoring this legislation. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this legislation. Mr. Speaker, there's a legal presumption in most countries, even third world countries, that if you accuse somebody of something, you've got to prove it. whether it's a civil case or whether it's a criminal case. The burden of proof is on the accuser. But that's not so in all countries when it comes to libel and slander. Take Great Britain, for example. It goes all the way back to when Great Britain, the king ruled the day, and if you criticize the king, even if you were right, off with your head. One of the reasons we broke away from Great Britain, formed our own country, was the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of press, and that's why we put those two fundamental principles first in our U.S. Constitution. Have a Constitution here, a pocket Constitution that most members of Congress carry with them, and the First Amendment protects the right of a free press and freedom of speech. And what has occurred, though, throughout the courts in Great Britain, in a libel case, in other words, somebody writes something about someone else, the person that is the subject matter doesn't like it, they file a lawsuit in Great Britain. And the burden is on the person who wrote the document to prove it's true. The burden is not on the accuser, like it would be in the United States. And that applies not only in libel cases, but slander cases. And it's taken place especially in books about Islamic terrorism throughout the United States, or throughout the world. Writers critical of Islamic terrorists are being sued by wealthy sheiks and Saudi billionaires, specifically Khalid bin Manfus, who was accused in alms for jihad of financing Islamic terrorists through Muslim charities. So what he did, he got mad about the Cambridge University Press for publishing this book, and he threatened to sue Cambridge University Press. And what happened in England, which I hope never happens in our press, they got so nervous about it, they started taking all the books off the shelves they could find, and they started destroying the books. In fact, they sent word throughout the world, if you have this book, Alms for Jihad, destroy the book, kind of like the old Berlin burnings of books back during World War II under the Nazis. And so Cambridge University Press gave in because the libel laws in England are different than they are in the United States. It's also occurred here in the United States under a similar book called Funding Evil, written by Rachel Enfield. And what she did was write a book in the United States, published in the United States, but some books, 23, worked their way to England. And here we go again. This author was sued in the courts of England and had the burden of proof to prove that her statements were true. Well, she filed suit against the people who sued her, once again, bin Manfus, and that lawsuit is now pending in our courts. I respectfully request another minute.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentleman from Texas an additional minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
And so what has occurred now is that our courts are hearing this matter. And it's all about the freedom of speech and the freedom of press. That's a human right. That's a universal right in this world, whether the courts in Great Britain recognize it or not. And it's important that people be free to write the truth and not suffer the consequences from it, and certainly not have to prove what they say is true just because somebody objects. And so this legislation is good to protect the publishers and the writers in the United States, that if they are sued in foreign courts, that those judgments will not be upheld unless that judgment would be upheld in courts in the United States. Important legislation, and I ask unanimous consent to put into the record an article from the San Francisco Chronicle talking about this entire concept of libel tourism.
Without objection.
And with that, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the remainder of our time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, my Texas colleague described the merits of this legislation so well a few minutes ago that I'd like to ask unanimous consent that my prepared statement, be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
And, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
All time having expired, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 6146 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.